Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Khalil Shariff. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of Aga Khan Foundation Canada, and it is a very special delight to welcome you all to the delegation of the Ismaili Imamate here in Ottawa, to all those of you who are here in the room, as well as the many people who are joining us online from the four corners of the world. For those of you who are not in the room, let me tell you that we here in Ottawa are at this place where the three rivers meet, which is a traditional land of the Algonquin people, who for generations were not only stewards of this land, but who had the responsibility and the grace to welcome First Nations from a very large catchment area in the spirit of exchange, of goods and services, for sure, but also of ideas and of relationships. And so it is a very special privilege to be able to be inspired by that long tradition among the First Nations of this area. And in this space, which when it was opened by His Highness Aga Khan 15 years ago now, was opened with the spirit that we might use it to have those conversations that might lift our collective aspirations and horizons for how we might contribute to a more peaceful and prosperous and pluralist world. Now, we do many things in this space, but this has to be one of my favorites. This is the most recent edition of a series called Global Reads, which is Aga Khan Foundation Canada's book club. And we have had the great delight of having extraordinary people who have been reflecting on the world, on some of its forces and dynamics, and what Canada might be doing in relation to those forces and dynamics on this stage. Our model is simple. We find someone of consequence and prominence in Canada's international affairs community, and we ask them to pick a book. And then they pick a book, and we find the author, and then they put them both on stage, and then we see what happens. And today, we have the extraordinary privilege of having Margaret Biggs, who is a former president of the Canadian International Development Agency. I think that was her most lofty office, if I can say, but is in fact had a very, very long and distinguished career in Canada's public service, and has continued her professional and personal commitment to thinking about Canada and its contributions to the world with a level of rigor and a level of enthusiasm and energy which is truly inspiring, Margaret. So we were delighted to invite Margaret to host this evening's discussion, and she, with wisdom and insight, has picked Joe Wong's book, From Development to Democracy, which is a tome, but it is extraordinarily interesting and fascinating, and if I can say, consequential for many things that are happening in the world today. Joe Wong is most recently the Vice President International of the University of Toronto, but for the purposes of our discussion here, is both a professor of political science at the University of Toronto and a professor at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. Joe has been involved as a political economist in all kinds of things, but not only is he a scholar, he has had the energy and I think the foresight to involve himself as a practitioner, engaging students in some tough core issues in development with an extraordinary effort he is architected called the REACH Initiative. Informed, I think, by this practical insight into what development looks like on the ground, but anchored in his training as a scholar of the very finest quality, he has put together with his co-author Dan Slater a book that really reflects on one of the core global issues of our time, which is the process of change in governance. How do we move from one governance footing to another? This is an issue which, of course, has been fascinating throughout history, but it feels particularly charged now when the idea and ideals of democracy seem to be under such pressure, when our own intuitions of what it looks like to support transition from one state of governance to a freer and more democratic state of governance are all confused. We don't even know anymore how we should help Should we help? Is it a good thing to help? In fact, is this trajectory toward democratization, in fact, the right and good one for everybody? All of these questions are now under massive pressure and under a great deal of scrutiny. And Joe's book and his work has shed light on this in a very interesting and important way. Now, I'm not going to give up any of its major conclusions. I'm going to let Margaret and Joe do that. But I do want to thank Margaret and Joe for agreeing to do this. I want to thank all of you here and online for joining us. I want to thank Global Affairs Canada, who has been a partner of ours in ensuring that we are having those conversations which will help us shed light on Canada's role on these issues. And I look forward to a very happy and insightful discussion. Margaret, Joe, over to you.
Thank you very much, Khalil. And I was absolutely delighted to be asked to be part of this year's 2023's book club, Global Reads. And again, with some discussion with Khalil and Uju to ask Joe if he would speak to us about and talk to us about his latest book, which is called Development to Democracy. And it focuses, of course, on the transitions or the transformations in modern Asia. I do know Joe in another life. He's a brilliant academic and scholar, but as Khalil said, he also is a doer and is brilliant in terms of his work that he has done in founding the REACH Alliance out of the University of Toronto, which I also know a little bit about, and then beyond. So it's really a treat to be able to have this conversation. I'm kind of in awe. I'm not a scholar in his league by any means, but to introduce the book, talk to him, and then open it up to all of you to discuss this really important book. I wanted to say just first a little bit, picking up on what Khalil said about the reasons why I picked this book and Joe. First of all, there's as you were alluding to, Khalil, there's really no more enduring question in the field of political science, but also in development studies and I think Canadian and foreign policy, international relations more generally, than the question of how countries democratize, how some countries democratize the relationship between economic development and democracy. And this book explores these questions in the context of post-war modern Asia. And it asks questions about why sometimes economic development doesn't necessarily lead to democratization. And why do we see these uneven patterns through East Asia and Southeast Asia in terms of development to democracy? The book also challenges the classic modernization theory that certainly I grew up with when I studied political science at the University of British Columbia, Khalil, that the level of economic development sort of necessarily leads to a regime change, a change in governance, and naturally with the growth of middle class and demands for greater agency and involvement and freedom that democracy would then unfold. The book also challenges what I think some of us, certainly I, our usual assumption that democracy kind of happens when autocratic or governments, regimes begin to falter and to fail. It actually turns that on its head. So the main thesis of the book is around democracy through strength, and this is what we're going to really probe with Joe today. And the final reason I picked this book is because, as Khalil said, issues around democracy and issues around democracy versus autocracy are sort of not just top of mind, but are kind of a primary focus of Canadian foreign policy, American foreign policy, everything that you see in the papers right now. So there really couldn't be anything more topical or timely than to have this conversation. And again, much of that discussion is at the very geopolitical level, but this book allows us to talk much more on the ground about how this process actually works or does not work in countries. So this book, it is an epic book. It has 12 case studies, so it dives deep into 12 countries in this post-war period, and there also is some explanatory categories, I would say, around 4 categories around that Dan and Joe grouped them into, and we'll see if Joe kind of takes us into a little bit of that in terms of the book. But it also then starts with and then ends on a very much more bigger level in terms of trying to draw out both theory and lessons around what they learned from their 12 case studies. So Joe, great. I told him it's going to be really tough.
It's like doctoral defense.
Yep. I cheated. I saw a couple of interviews that Joe did elsewhere, and what I found really, really helpful to kick off this discussion was to ask you, Joe, about the genesis of the book. Like, the genesis of the book and the genesis of your interest in the issues around development to democracy. So tell us a little bit about, go back to your grad school days.
Okay, sure. Well, first of all, thank you all for coming. And it's a real treat to actually wear my scholar hat. As Paul knows, all too often now I'm in a suit pretending to be the vice president of the University of Toronto. Actually, I'm never in a suit, but I mean, I'm expected to be in a suit. But it was really terrific to receive an invitation to actually talk about my scholarly work and something that I care very deeply about. So thank you to our hosts as well. This is a real privilege for me to be able to participate in this. So as Margaret's already noted, the book is around this idea of democracy through strength. And where the idea germinated, in my mind, actually goes back to 2000, which was around the time I was finishing my PhD. I finished in 2001 and started my career at U of T right after that. In 2000, there were elections in Taiwan, and there was an election observer delegation organized by the Fulbright Foundation. And I've had the privilege, actually, of being part of these election delegations now for every election since 2000. In fact, I'll be in Taiwan in January as part of another Fulbright delegation, as there are going to be elections then. And in 2000, though, I was a graduate student and a PhD student, and I was with my doctoral advisor, Professor Edward Friedman, and he had been a long-time scholar of China, of Taiwan, an outspoken critic of the autocratic regimes. He had in fact been blacklisted in Taiwan, and he's subsequently been blacklisted now in the PRC as well for his championing of democracy. Anyway, in 2000 we were there, and it was the night of the election. And for anyone who's been to one of these elections in Taiwan, you know it's a really raucous affair. And we were at the rally for the victorious candidate, who was Chen Shui-bian. And President-elect Chen was from the opposition. So this was a real milestone for Taiwan's very young democracy, right? It had only had its founding presidential elections in 1996. So that the opposition candidate was now the president-elect was really momentous. And everyone was going bonkers. You know, it was like a big party and everything. And the president-elect Chen Shui-bian was being escorted onto the stage. And I looked to my advisor, and he was tearing up. And I asked him, I said, Ed, this is a happy moment. Why are you tearing up? And he said, you know, it's not lost on me, the irony, that the very security apparatus that is now protecting Chen Shui-bian is the same security apparatus that had imprisoned him a few decades before. And so that was the instinct that kind of got me to thinking about this idea of how do autocratic regimes concede democracy peacefully and with stability, right? Now, as a young assistant professor at that time, I had other things that I needed to do and, you know, like get my first book out and all this sort of stuff. But this was something that had always niggled away in my mind, was that what we saw here was a regime in Taiwan, the incumbent regime was the Kuomintang, or the KMT, that had essentially conceded democracy not through the collapse of the regime, but actually conceding democratic transition when the regime was in a position of strength. So much so that the security apparatus, as I note, that had once imprisoned this very candidate was now actually protecting him and bringing in this new era of democracy. So that stood out to me as a puzzle. It's something that I always thought required some explanation. And it wasn't until about 10 years later, I was at a conference somewhere, and Dan Slater, who at the time was at the University of Chicago, we're contemporaries, we're around the same age. We had known of each other for a long time. He's a very prominent scholar of Southeast Asia. And he had just written a really great article on what he called dominant party democratization in Singapore and in Malaysia. And it was really a kind of prospects of democracy. And so I just went up to him, I said, hey, Dan, you and I have never met. We know of each other. I've certainly followed your work. I'd hope you'd follow mine. I've been thinking about this for a long time, and I shared with him my reflections on Taiwan. And next thing you know, we found ourselves in Madison, Wisconsin, at a cafe. It was like, we had our laptops open, like, when you're playing Battleship and you've got the two laptops open. And in the course of one weekend, we wrote 18,000 words, and that was our first article. And that came out in 2013 on democracy through strength. And it was all about how former autocratic regimes have the capacity to transform themselves into enduring, stable democracies. And that's really the genesis of what ends up becoming the book. And I might also add, if I might, the article came out and it was received very well, and so Princeton University Press approached us and asked if we would write a book. And so Dan called and said, what do you think? Should we write the book? And I said no, because I was busy doing other things. And he said, what if we dedicated it to Ed Friedman, who had been his undergraduate advisor and my PhD advisor, and that was it. And I said, if we're going to dedicate it to Ed, then for sure we'll write the book. And that was in 2014, and the book came out just last year.
Well, that's, so we just sort of touched a little bit, touched the surface of the main central argument of Joe's book, which is democracy through strength. So let's probe that a little bit more, because the book is 375 pages, and there's these 12 case studies. And I read it, but maybe he hasn't. So you write, it might seem like a truism to say that democracy can only emerge once an authoritarian regime has become too weak to endure. Yet developmental Asia's historical democratization experience consistently shows otherwise. So this is kind of counterintuitive to the way in which we often think about it. But in the book, you go through a number of case studies, and they don't all democratize through strength. Many of them actually don't end up democratizing entirely, but you start off in the book with juxtaposing, like, for example, the Philippines in 1986, and then South Korea in 1988. And so just tell us a little bit more about, this is like, tell us about your book in 3 minutes, Joe, but sure. about this central argument of your book and some of the counterexamples where it didn't work.
Yeah, so basically the prevailing conventional wisdom is such that we think that democracy emerges from the ashes of a collapsed autocratic regime, right? So when we're thinking about democratic prospects anywhere in the world, we're essentially looking for autocratic regimes that are weak, right? That are about to collapse, that are, that are illegitimate and so forth. And in fact, in many ways, that's the case of Philippines in 1986, right? You see a regime that essentially collapses through its own, under the weight of its own illegitimacy. The incumbent leader basically has to flee the country and so forth. And that is what we call a classic case of democracy through weakness. This is where the incumbent regime is so weak, it collapses, and in its place emerges what we argue is a democracy, but one that is not necessarily enduring, nor is it particularly stable. And I think that Philippines actually is a good example of that. What we argue instead in the case of South Korea, and that's just more of an anecdote at the beginning, it's intended to be more of an illustrative anecdote, is that what we see in South Korea, for instance, is a regime in 1987 that actually is still pretty strong, right? Now it had, this was a nasty, brutal autocratic regime that had unleashed things like the Gwangju massacre earlier in the decade. Chun Doo-hwan was by every measure a terrible, terrible dictator and so forth. But the regime and the party itself was still relatively strong, i.e. the opposition was also relatively weak. And so what we see there is a regime in June of 1987, quite unexpectedly actually, announcing, right, in the face of some protests, in the face of massive protest actually, announcing that presidential elections would be held later that year in December of 87, and then full legislative elections in March of 88. And what we end up seeing actually is that the incumbent regime stays in power. It actually wins those elections. Now, it had a gamble that the opposition would split the vote, and there were a whole bunch of risks that it took to do this. But we argue that that's a good example of an autocratic regime that's conceding from a position of relative strength. And it unleashes then a series of democratic reforms thereafter and so on. And what we see then in South Korea is what has become a very enduring and stable, and by every indicator and measure or metric, a stable democracy. So that's the kind of juxtaposition that we start with. South Korea is not the paradigmatic case. The paradigmatic case of our theory is Taiwan. Right? Taiwan is the best example of a regime that is extremely strong, it's extremely powerful, and in many ways, it's very popular in the mid-1980s. An opposition party forms in September of 1986. They call themselves the Democratic Progressive Party. Everybody expects the incumbent regime to crush it, because that's what autocratic regimes do, but they don't. They actually allow the opposition party to form. The regime lifts martial law in 87. Partial elections are held in 89. Elections are then held in 92, and full presidential elections in 1996. And the key point here is that this was a strong regime that did not resist democratization, but in fact conceded democracy and allowed democracy to flourish in Taiwan. That in many ways stands in, in complete opposition to the kind of democracy through weakness scenario that we typically look for. And we say that that's really a wrong-headed way to think about democratic transition.
So in the book, because you'll all read it, there are these 4 categories, which are explanatory. Developmental statism, I guess, which is the East Asian countries, developmental socialism, or whatever, that's China, Vietnam, da-da-da-da. There's an interesting category, developmental Britannia, where you might assume with the legacy of the British legal system, you have Hong Kong, Malaysia, and Singapore, so another interesting example. And then we have developmental militarism, where we have Taiwan, Thailand, and Indonesia. Blah, blah, blah. Yeah. So again, they're all kind of a bit different. But and so I really commend you to dive into them. But at what Joe and Dan do in the book is there's the core argument, but at the crux, they talk about the bittersweet spot. When an authoritarian regime, as Joe was just kind of saying, takes a chance on democratic reforms. And of course, there's examples where they don't. China, will come back to that. But, so tell us a little bit more about this bitter and sweet spot where, again, kind of counterintuitively, autocratic, regimes, leaders, elites somehow take the decision to take the risk. And so tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so let me, just to be sure and to be clear, because you can imagine, when I've given this talk in places like Taiwan and whatever, in Korea, they'll say, you're not saying that Jiang Jingguo was a Democrat, right? I mean, and he was the incumbent leader in Taiwan that we argue conceded or allowed democracy to flourish there. The core of our argument is that these autocratic regimes, their core preference is to stay in power, right? It's not like Jiang Jingguo wakes up one morning and says, I'm a Democrat now, right? He's sitting there thinking, how do we change the rules of the game to ensure the KMT stays in power? This is what we assume as political scientists, political parties and ruling parties, their core preference is to actually stay in power. And the argument then is that actually democracy, which many people assume is antithetical to the interests of authoritarians, is actually incentive compatible. If we democratize, this is a way for our regime to stay in power, right? And so that's really one of the sort of core tenets of our argument. The bittersweet spot, however, refers to a specific moment in a regime's life in which this regime, this autocratic regime, has accumulated what we call strengths, right? It's accumulated a coherent party organization. It's accumulated a developmental record. So we were very careful in saying that these cases are in developmental Asia. So in Taiwan and South Korea, these places were growing at 10% a year. They had amassed just an extraordinary developmental record. And so they are endowed with these strengths, but they hit a moment in which their power begins to wane. So they've passed their apex of power. And they receive signals that they've passed their apex of power. It's not like they just sort of fumble in the dark and feel like they're losing power. They get signals. Maybe it's protest. Maybe it's your international, geopolitics start to conspire against you. In the case of Taiwan, it was the derecognition of the Republic of China, for instance, beginning in the 1970s. Or it might be a cable sent from the US president or the president's office to Chunduhuan saying, you cannot allow the military to crush this opposition in the summer of '87. So that's another signal. It could be electoral, right? It could be, these autocratic regimes had elections. They were total sham elections because opposition parties couldn't participate under martial law. But it was a great way for the party to sort of see, like, are we still in people's good books, right? And so they receive these signals, and at a moment in which they see that their hold on power is beginning to wane, they enter what we call the bittersweet spot. It's bitter because their unassailable authoritarian grip on power is beginning to wane. But it's still sweet in that they're popular enough, they're powerful enough, they have enough institutional strength, they have a developmental record and so forth, that if they were to concede democratic elections, in all likelihood, they would win. Or at worst, they would at least survive, right? And so the argument is that through the life of an autocratic regime, you accumulate strength, you accumulate power, you accumulate a developmental record. At some point, you hit the apex of power, you go past it, and that's the ideal moment for an autocratic regime to concede democracy. And we see that in the case of Taiwan, we see that in the case of South Korea, we see that in the case of post-war Japan, and we even see it in the case of Indonesia, right? Golkar experiences lots of signals in the post-1997 Asian financial crisis, like it's an economy in tatters, it's a weak president in Habibie, Suharto steps down and so forth. There's a whole bunch of signals that this is a weakening regime. But it was still, as a political party in Golkar, strong enough that if it were to concede democracy sooner rather than later, it would in all likelihood survive. And that's exactly what happens actually in Indonesia. Golkar remains the second most powerful political party after founding elections, and Golkar, in fact, was the kingmaker in many ways after Indonesia had democratized. So that's, the bittersweet spot is a moment in which, if autocrats are being strategic, signals the best time in which to concede democracy. Now, that being said, you can also miss that bittersweet spot. You can miss that window, and you can hurdle, or as we describe, you can hurdle through that bittersweet spot, after which case, then, the autocrat's best strategy is to hang on and repress, right? And so that's an outcome that nobody wants, obviously, at least those who champion democracy. So the key is really to ensure that autocrats see it's in their best interest to concede democracy when they're in that bittersweet spot.
Well, let's segue to the elephant in the room, China. So the book has a whole chapter on post-war China up to 1989, and then there's most of another chapter that talks about more recent period. And so going back to the bittersweet point, I guess I'll let Joe explain it, but did China miss its bittersweet spot, or is the bittersweet spot to come, or will it ever materialize? And again, we won't hold you to your prognostication, but I guess, we have gone through, in the West, a period where we thought that, economic development and integration into the global trading and financial system and all these things would lead to, again, a more liberalization in terms of governance in that country. And then some people say that we should have caught on to that sooner rather than later, but certainly under President Xi, there has been a reversal on that. Yeah. So this is on everyone's mind in terms of where actually China might go. So Joe, tell us how this fits in your theory.
Yeah, I was just, tomorrow morning I'm actually teaching my honors seminar, and I assigned this book, Black Swans, and if you haven't read it yet, the author criticizes political scientists for having made no proper predictions ever in the history of the world. So I'm very happy to contribute to that trend, just so that we stay with the normal distribution of wrong outcomes and wrong predictions. I mean, 1989 and June 4th was obviously a pivotal moment. It was, for me, I was in high school at the time, it was probably my own sort of political awakening, right? This was, I recall going to Convocation Hall at U of T, where dissidents who had managed to escape China were talking to the community, and for me this was huge. I had never thought, I never fancied myself as someone being particularly political, and certainly not international that way. And I had never really crystallized in my mind just how important democracy was and how I had taken it so much for granted. So that was a really important moment, and I think it's something that's has stood and has endured in all of our minds as a potential window for the CCP to have democratized. So much so that, as we know, in China, it's been completely erased from collective history, and that's not an exaggeration. When I talk to my students of mine who are from China, or when I'm in China talking to students there, they have no idea, right? So it was clearly something that even the regime wants to exorcise from the nation's collective memory. In the book, however, we argue that June 4th, 1989 was not a missed window of opportunity for a democracy through strength scenario to unfold. And the reason is because the argument we make there is that in 1989, the regime was too weak. This was not a strong regime. When you think about the CCP in 1989, it was internally fragmented. There was a great deal of elite factional conflict, right down to some very rudimentary premises. There was a deep ideological conflict between a more reformist faction, led by people like Zhao Ziyang and others, and a much more conservative faction under Li Peng and so on. So this was not a strong regime, a strong party regime as we describe it. This was also not, I mean, in some ways when we forget, I mean, we tend to think of China today through the lens of post-1992 China, where China's economy really skyrockets, right? This was not the industrial dynamo that we see now. This was still primarily an agricultural economy. And just to put a finer point on it, it was only a decade post-Cultural Revolution, right, in which you essentially saw the regime and Chinese society and the very fabric of society being torn apart. So this was not a strong regime. This was not a candidate for democracy through strength. And had China democratized then, I think we could have been quite skeptical about the enduring stability that might have ensued, or the lack thereof. The argument we make in the book, and it is much more speculative in the last chapter on developmental socialism, and that cluster, is that if there was ever a candidate case for democracy through strength other than Singapore's PAP, which is just about there anyway, it would be the CCP in China today. That this is a regime that is very strong. It is a party that is more coherent than it has been historically. It has a developmental record that, frankly, has been described as having guided China, through the most historically remarkable, historically unprecedented transformation of a society and economy and so forth, right? This is a regime that ought to have the confidence, which is one of the key sort of terms we use in the book, should have the confidence to concede democracy from a position of strength. That is, if the CCP were to concede democracy today, it's inconceivable that it wouldn't stay in power, right? In part because there's just no viable opposition. It's done a pretty good job of ensuring that. But in part because, frankly, the CCP is still relatively well regarded, right? And it has an extraordinary track record to run on. It should have every confidence that if it were to democratize, China would remain stable and that it would stay in power. In other words, as I've noted before, it's incentive compatible for the regime to concede democracy at this moment. And so, you know, I think it's a compelling argument, right? I mean, I think it's something that actually we could actually go to our friends in China and say, hey, you might want to consider this. So we did, and we have. And you know, through the 2010s, when we were writing the book, you know, we could actually, Dan and I could give talks in China on this topic, right? Democracy through strength in China. I mean, we actually gave lectures at the party school in Beijing and Shanghai, right? So this was not a taboo topic because the way in which we were approaching it was not saying democracy will arrive in China when you, the regime, collapses, right? When you are so corrupt and so rotten from in the core that democracy might emerge. We're actually saying, look, you know, you should have every confidence that if you were to concede democracy now, you're going to stay in power. And you would be able to stay in power through a different kind of legitimacy, and frankly, a more enduring one. Because, you know, in China, if you were to think about, if you're the regime, the future that you should be thinking about is, boy, I'd like to be the KMT in Taiwan rather than Ceausescu. Or I'd rather be the KMT in Taiwan rather than the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, right, which is now completely obsolete. So we've given this talk in China, and, you know, the reaction has been really kind of cool. It's been pretty interesting. Like, people have said, like, this isn't offensive, right? So this isn't a typical Western scholar coming in and telling us that we're bad and we hope the regime collapses and that you're all out and so forth. But the other reaction we had, and I'll never forget this conversation, because one of the party school members, one of the party school colleagues came up to me and said, you know, Professor Wong, this is really interesting. We've never heard this before. And he said, you know, I actually agree with you. Like, I actually think this makes a lot of sense. And this makes a lot of sense for the regime to really seriously consider. And then he said, and this is very telling, he said, but, you know, I think it would be better if we did this after my son graduated from Harvard. Right? And I think that actually speaks volumes about what is at the core of our argument. That you are nonetheless risking something, right? You are nonetheless risking what appears to be stable in the present moment for a gamble that this is actually going to lead to enduring stability. And even though logically, theoretically, this should make a lot of sense and it should be a relatively low-risk proposition, those who are enjoying the spoils of the stability and of the returns to the regime now are nervous about making that concession and are willing to oftentimes kick the can down the road a little bit longer. So there's a very sort of human instinct here, right? It's one thing to say retrospectively and historically, wow, look, you know, the conservatives in Japan did this, the autocratic regime in Korea did this, the KMT in Taiwan did this, the Indonesians did this. It's one thing to say retrospectively, this really supports the theory. It's another when it's your own interests and it's your own grip on power. And so that's one of the reasons why I think we haven't seen this in China, because I think that it's still seen as a risk. The other thing I would say, and there are a whole host of reasons, and in the book we catalog, you know, inventorize basically all the reasons why we're skeptical that despite what we see to be a very powerful theory, this is unlikely to happen. But I will highlight another one. You hear often when you're in China, they will point to the Soviet Union as the example that is the core lesson for them. They'll oftentimes say, you know, the Soviet Union and the collapse of the Soviet Union, you know, the core lesson there is if you democratize, you invite chaos and you invite instability and you essentially accelerate or hasten the regime's demise. And this is what they always see as being the core lesson of the collapse and the death and the obsolescence of the CPSU. Our counter-argument to them is that you're actually drawing the wrong lesson from the Soviet Union. What the Soviet Union demonstrates is that by the time the regime concedes democracy, it's too late, right? It had essentially expired or gone past their best before date. So perestroika and glasnost did not excel. I mean, they were not the reason why the CPSU collapses. They merely revealed the internal rot of the regime and brought to the fore the animus against the regime. In other words, by the time the CPSU concedes democracy, it's weak. It had already hurtled through the bittersweet spot. And so therefore the lesson to the CCP in China is don't wait too long. Do it when you're more powerful. And the longer you wait, the fewer options you have. And so looking forward, you know, if I were back in China, and I hope to be again in the spring, I would say in the wake of the publication of this book, is to say to them, look, there are real problems on the horizon. The longer you wait, the more hemmed in you're going to be, the fewer options you're going to have, and the less confidence you should have if you're considering a concession strategy. So do it sooner rather than later.
Okay, I'm going to sneak in a question, then I'm going to go into my punchy question. But this is a sneaky question first, because you do cover it in the book a bit, but the book is largely about endogenous factors, things that are endogenous to these countries and to these states themselves, the roles of the elite, the military, level of economic development, whatever, ethnic diversity, all these other factors. But there's an international environment as well, and in some cases was quite positive and conducive to these internal changes that were happening. I'm thinking particularly about South Korea, maybe Taiwan. You made a few little references. You got a phone call from the White House or whatever. Right. So then, but looking ahead, and not just in terms of China, but maybe China, but others, like the international environment may not be quite as reinforcing or conducive right now. Just it's because of the geopolitical overlay around these issues, and it's not to say that countries like the United States and Canada aren't wishing for this, but it's not, I don't think, going to be as easy because I guess their international risks or the geopolitical risks are higher. I mean, I didn't articulate that very well, but I think you know what I'm getting at. Yeah. Tell us about that, about the role of international factors in terms of either helping or hindering the kinds of transitions that you're talking about.
Yeah, that's actually one of the that's one of the things that we wanted this book to be able to do, was to really address and to put into the minds of the international community a different way of thinking about how democracy might emerge how it might emerge in the non-democratic world. And so I'll respond in two ways. One is as I already intimated earlier on, I think we need to think beyond, as international advocates, for instance, of democracy, we need to think beyond the collapsist antecedent to democracy as being the only way in which democracy can emerge, right? And I think that what this book does is it provides ample evidence that, sure, collapsism or the democracy emerging from the ashes of a collapsed regime is one way in which democracy might emerge, but frankly, the historical record suggests that it's actually not the most stable way, and it's not the pathway to more enduring democracies, but that there's actually an alternative way, right? And so that should shape how it is that we think about the prospects for democracy. I'll give you an example. Like when we were writing this book, or actually before our first article came out, there's a blog, it used to be a blog called The Monkey Cage, that the Washington Post sponsored, and it was a place where a lot of us would sort of throw out some ideas, preprints and working papers and so on. And we wrote the paper on democracy through strength, and it made its way to Monkey Cage. And somehow it made its way to the American ambassador to Ethiopia's office in the early around 2010, 2011, or 2012, around there. And the American ambassador apparently read this paper and was like, wow, this is a really interesting way to talk about democracy in Ethiopia in a way that doesn't offend, or in a way in which the incumbent regime has to really grapple with this, right? It can't just be simply dismissed as, oh, you Westerners telling us how to do things, or all you American foreign policy establishment telling us how we have to run our own business and so on. This actually put to the EPRDF government a theory it needed to grapple with. And so Dan and I got this mysterious email, and this was really before, phishing really became as endemic as it is now. And the subject line was an interesting proposal, right? And we open up the email, which we would never do now, but we open up the email, and it was a proposal from one of the think tanks in Washington that was funded by the Ford Foundation that had somehow gotten wind of what the American ambassador to Ethiopia was thinking and invited Dan and me to Addis to just hang out with these dictators for like 2 weeks. And so we went, and we agreed, we signed a form that said we would never write about it. I'd love to one day, so it's like was it Mr. Smith goes to Washington? Was that the thing? It was like Mr. Slater and Mr. Wong go to Addis and just talk about these adventures. And we actually ended up sitting down and talking to Hailemariam, who was the prime minister at that time, for 3 hours. And he had tons of questions, stuff like, in Taiwan, in Ethiopia, we don't have political prisoners. But if we did have political prisoners, like when did the KMT release the political, was it before the election commission was set up or after? So they were really contemplating this playbook, right? So this is all to say there is actually a discourse in the international arena that can put the question of democracy to autocrats in a way that they're forced to grapple with. Because it actually says to them, you've been very successful in delivering development. Grapple with this theory about why you should or shouldn't democratize. And it's a way that does it, that they're forced to actually have to grapple with. The second thing I'd say about the international is that just as I was describing how regimes become more hemmed in and they have fewer choices the longer they wait, this autocracy versus democracy juxtaposition hems those regimes in as well. We're not really giving the CCP much choice here anymore, right? And if we're going to frame the conversation as the virtuous democracies versus the evil autocracies debate, and don't get me wrong, there's nothing more despicable to me than an autocratic regime, but if we frame it in that way, we actually don't give the CCP much choice, because there's no way Xi Jinping is going to wake up one morning and say, oh boy, this pressure is getting to me. I think I'm going to democratize now. That's just not going to happen. And so long as we continue to apply pressure in that way, it actually makes it less likely that democracy will emerge in China. So if there's a way, and I implore our foreign policymakers to think creatively about this, if there's a way to actually talk about democracy as being incentive compatible for autocratic regimes, that they're holding up their end of the bargain as to truly democratize, but that nonetheless, if they do it well and they do it legitimately, they may stay in power, and that's actually okay as long as they're democratic. I mean, that's a totally different way of thinking about democracy. Currently, right now, the only way in which democracy will emerge in China in the collective imagination of the world is if the CCP collapses, and collapses spectacularly. Just think about that for a moment. What do you think the prospects of democracy are going to be like? An enduring, stable, prosperous democracy. What do you think that's going to be like if the CCP regime completely collapses? We're talking about 1.4 billion people. We're talking about reverberations around the world. There just has to be a different way in which we can talk about it. So I think the current geopolitical debate is one that I think makes a lot of sense, in the sense that we have the champions of democracy being more enthusiastic than ever before, but juxtaposing this against autocracy is unlikely to yield the kind of result that we would like to see.
Well, I'm just going to ask one more. I know we're running out of time for this part of it, but I did want to turn, and you've already started it, on the implications of your work, of the study that you and Dan have done, and the conclusions you come to for foreign policy, for people who practice international development, because of the moment that we're finding ourselves in. So, and if I, just a little segue, just a little footnote. For me, reading the book, one of my big aha was Because I think we always think of democracy as, you know, freedom fighters, we're the good guys, and that good will always prevail, and to actually, and I should have figured it out, but like actually no, in these cases, democracy or the democratic instinct wasn't because all of a sudden these dictators wanted to become Democrats, but because it was in their self-interest to kind of move a little bit in that direction. And you know, it sounds, when you say it, it sounds kind of like obvious, but it's not the way in which I think democracy support and democracy promotion has been framed by Canada and other countries. So I've got two, like, so what questions for you, Joe. And the first one is, you know, we've had decades and generations of actually democracy support, democracy promotion. The Biden administration's going to have its next democracy summit in South Korea, interestingly. So it's become kind of a big thing again. So what are the implications from your thinking and your writing for where we go in that space? And Canada also has said repeatedly, the current government, the previous government, human rights, democracy, freedom, rule of law, they're at the center of our foreign policy. So like, we haven't really figured out how to do that, so you could help on that front. And the second thing, second so what question for you, and I am gonna read this little paragraph. You say in the book, you know, this is the conclusion, so you guys can fast forward to the concluding chapter, but democracy may very well be a universal value. In other words, and people everywhere would generally prefer to be governed democratically than autocratically, all else being equal. And here you're sort of saying it's not just a Western thing, like we got these Eastern Asian countries where, whatever. But nowhere in the world is democracy the ultimate value, in the sense that people anywhere can be expected to prioritize democracy over a peaceful and prosperous way of life. In other words, for democracies to survive or sustain, and the example you just gave for China, is that they have to deliver. They have to deliver prosperity, well-being, and stability for their populations. And that's not really the way we often think about democracy promotion and democracy support. So there's a lot of implications there for what a country like Canada might do in this space. So those are like huge issues, Joe, and Uju says we've only got a couple minutes more. So if you could just, just talk to us a little bit about, you know, how you, having written this book, how you think about those issues.
So again, just to reiterate, I think that one way is in these international fora in which you're engaging with thought leaders, in which you're engaging with practitioners and so forth, is to really start thinking about alternative pathways to democracy. I really think this collapsist precondition is very problematic. And if we can just start moving away from that as being the only antecedent or precondition for democracy to emerge, I think we would have gone a long way. It's not to say that democracy through strength is the only way. I would imagine there's got to be lots of different ways in which it might emerge. But the focus on collapsism, I think, is a real hindrance. And that leads then to the second point, is that when regimes do democratize, it's critically important that they be that they're integrated into the global economy, that they're integrated in ways in which prosperity can be shared around the world, in which the marginalized are less marginalized and so forth. Because as we say in the book, and I think Dan actually wrote that statement. I mean, he's a beautiful writer, so it's beautiful, but you really have to think about it for a while. You know, if democracies don't deliver that, right, that's a real problem. So not only is the international community, it is not only in the international community's interest to create alternative or to generate alternative pathways to democracy, it's the international community's interest to also cultivate these democracies, to ensure that they're delivering in ways that are enduring and that can result in more stable and sustainable transformations. And that's a real challenge. And, you know, again, I think a lot of that is to move away from the current discourse which pits one set of nations against another. I'm speaking here as a university administrator. I think it's critically important that universities, where the exchange of ideas can take place, are engaged with places like China. It strikes me that if China were ever to politically liberalize, it would be to our disadvantage if we have no engines revved up and we have no connections and there are no dialogues occurring. So, you know, in the meantime, as we kind of engage these conversations, underneath there have to be these kinds of connections as well, because it's in our interest to ensure that when these regimes democratize, they're delivering.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
I just came back from Africa yesterday, and I was saying to Margaret, I've had like 3 hours sleep, I was saying to Margaret, I hope my brain works. So
I think his brain's working.
With apologies if I just prattled on, because
his brain's working, but we're going to make it work a little bit longer. So we're going to have questions from the audience here. People can help you, and also there are a number of people, many people online who also might pose questions. So Joe had a cup of coffee before we started, so he's good to go.
It's a professor's tactic to just ramble on for a while.
Margaret and Joe, thank you for coming. This is very interesting. It is a topic of the times in many ways. So I have one comment and one question. So is that okay? The comment is, when you look at China's growth trajectory, I'm going back to my 1982 development economics classroom. If somebody had said in the class that you can maintain a 10% growth rate over a period of 7 years, we would have laughed him out of the class because that was impossible. It has never happened before and probably will not repeat. And when you realize that it took England how much? 60 to 100 years to double its income with all its colonies to exploit? But it took China only 30 years to double its income. I don't think we can dismiss that part. It really needs an inquiry to understand what was really happening in China and how did they go about doing this. It was a tremendous economic transformation. I mean, you can call it enlightened despotism or whatever it is. On the question of China again, I think given the fact that US has obviously identified China as a major threat in some sense, I don't think this would then be the time for China. I don't think the Chinese would, at this stage, would be thinking of carrying out any political experiments. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. They would rather be feeling that we need to continue as we are and so on. Anyway, that was my comment. Mm-hmm. The question that I had on political transition, when autocratic regimes fall, there's often a call for elections. Mm-hmm. You know, oh, you need to hold now elections and everybody get together. But you know, elections is not only, of course, democracy, because you need existing institutions to support the transition or to apply the checks and balances in the system. Now, when you look at the fact that most of the autocratic regimes are autocratic because they are non-existent institutions. And when you look at countries like trying to carry out a transformation, and you only have to look at Libya and Iraq. Okay? Remove the autocracy. Oh, now it's wonderful, we'll have democracy. Well, we don't have democracy. Mm-hmm. Now I'm wondering, is this the question that has always been on my mind? What would you do in a situation when an autocratic regime falls, okay, and there are no other institutions really around to promote, sustain, or even engender democracy? Thank you.
Great question, and I have an answer. We are very, in terms of this book, we're very specific in saying we're interested in the region that we call developmental Asia. So people have said, well, why don't you include Philippines? Why don't you include North Korea and so forth, right? You're all Asianists, why do you exclude these particular countries? And we say because they're not in the region that we call developmental Asia. And what are some of the signature characteristics of developmental Asia? One is an intent to economically develop. And the second is precisely that there are institutions in place, right? Chief among which are political parties. Political parties are, in one sense, part of the vote-getting machinery, but they, as institutions, are extremely important as well, in the sense that they have rules of the game, that there is some organizational coherence, there's often discipline and so forth. And so the presence of parties and the institutions that support those parties is a precondition for democracy through strength. So I'll give you an example. My favorite chapter in the book actually is the one on post-war Japan. Because the prevailing conventional wisdom on Japan is that, look, this was just a democracy that was fully imposed from external forces, right? There's no agency in Japan at all, and minus the American occupation, democracy would never have happened. Now, we're not historical revisionists to say that, you know, the American occupation wasn't absolutely crucial, necessary, and the most important factor. But what was also important was the fact that there was an institutional legacy from the Taisho era of the 1930s in which political parties actually emerged. You had political parties, you had a national legislature, you had an election commission. They all succumbed to fascism eventually in the 1930s. But you actually had these institutional predecessors or antecedents that in many ways flowed through into the post-war period. So the conservative parties that emerged in 46, 47 to contest the Japanese Socialist Party, these were actually parties that were the rebirth of what were conservative parties from the 1920s. So you're absolutely right. There need to be these institutions in place for this to occur. You know, we're not at all suggesting, in fact, we're suggesting the exact opposite, that it's not a tabula rasa, right? A tabula rasa is where we would argue that actually you see unstable, right, and ultimately unsustainable democracies emerge, precisely the kinds of cases that you've just described. On the China front, what has happened in China is absolutely remarkable, and for all the reasons that you've said. And there are, you know, as a political economist, I could give you a whole host of other reasons why I think what's happened has happened in China. But we are seeing dark clouds on the horizon. Right? We do know, and we have known for decades, that local debt is a major problem. Scholars and economists have uncovered this for years. And now we're seeing that actually local debt is potentially a major hamper, if you will, hindrance to continued economic growth. We know that the economy is over-leveraged in certain areas. This is one of the reasons why we see the export of capital through the Belt and Road initiative. We know that growth has largely, in unhealthy ways, been driven by investment as opposed to consumption, right? And this is something that has been out of balance for a long time. So what China has achieved is absolutely remarkable, but it does not inure it from some dark clouds on the horizon.
Do we have anybody online?
I read your book and found it very interesting. And thank you for intellectual adventure here. I have two questions for you. One is from my experience in Singapore, which is a society that I have gradually come to admire a lot more than I did when I first went there 7 or 8 years ago. And my question is, what would have to happen in order for you to classify Singapore as a democratic country, which in many respects, to me, it already is? My second question has to do with what I think, something that I thought was a bit missing in your story about stable democracies, and that is the rule of law. And the notion of a constitution and the rule of law as an element in guaranteeing the stability of democracy. You know, one of the few exceptions I make to my opinion that Singapore, in fact, at this point is a democracy, is that it does not have a fully independent judiciary that enforces the constitution, which places limits on what the politicians can do. And so I would appreciate your comments on those 2 points.
Thank you. Yeah, Singapore is a tough case. When we, obviously we have a lot of friends and connections and so forth in Singapore, and when the book came out, Dan and I were invited to give a series of talks there, and, including one at National University of Singapore, with an audience filled with friendly allies and people who are sympathetic to the argument that we make. But I recall one was a really great colleague and an extraordinary critic of the PAP historically, said basically the same thing you said, and that is that, you know, there's a very fine line in Singapore between what we code as an autocratic Singapore versus a democratic Singapore. And he challenged us in saying that Singapore could become a democracy and you might not even know it. And I think he's right, right? I think he's absolutely right. And so when there is further evidence of, you know, a more level playing field, when there's evidence that the PAP is willing to concede, not electoral defeat, because that's unlikely to happen anytime soon, but willing to concede, you know, rules of the game such that the opposition may actually gain an uncomfortable seat share and so forth, then I think those are instances in which we can begin to think about coding Singapore as a democracy. On the question of rule of law, that's an important one. And in the developmental Britannia, so we have these clusters, and the clusters, so, and as you've read the book, you'll know there's developmental Britannia, developmental socialism, which we talked a little bit about, developmental militarism, which is really focused on military regimes and the military regime's instinct to maintain stability, hence the prevalence of coups. And developmental statism, which is Japan, Taiwan, South Korea. Developmental Britannia is an interesting category, as you'll know, because we have there Singapore, Malaysia, and Hong Kong. And in many ways, you know, these are really good candidate cases for eventual democratization, because there is at least some modicum of a legal infrastructure there in place, right? That these are unquestionably not rule of person or rule of man regimes, but rather ones that are constrained by relatively robust legal systems. And so again, you know, the point there is that these have the institutional hallmarks of what could become a more robust democracy, a more liberal democracy. The challenge for these regimes is that in many ways their legalistic foundations, right, remove the incentive to take that last step. That's the problem. That in fact, in their minds, as rule of law regimes, comparatively speaking, there is no need to reform any further. And this is what we, you know, this is, I mean, Hong Kong was never going to become a democracy. It's not a state, but this is where we see democracy activists essentially losing out. This is one of the concerns that we see in Malaysia, and this is one of the worries that we see in Singapore.
Do I have time for one more? Well, maybe I'm just going to put a couple, I don't see any more here in the room, so I'm going to indulge and do my short snappers at the end here, okay. Joe, which is in the book, two of the countries in the case studies are, one's Thailand and one is Myanmar. And they've both been in the news recently, and both have changed as you were writing this book, which took 9 years, because things were changing. So tell us just a little bit about, you and I talked before the meeting about Myanmar, which I think we kind of know a little bit, but talk to the room here and everybody about Myanmar, and also about Thailand, which is another sort of variation. You've got the military, but you also got the kingdom and the royalty, et cetera, and yet, you know, very economically very, very advanced. So just quick snappers on Myanmar and Thailand.
So Myanmar is a really, it's a really sad case, right? We were there right after the founding elections, and there was just such extraordinary hope in Myanmar. It was an exciting time. And for anyone who's ever doubted the power of democracy, just visit a country and talk to people after it has democratized, or at least the people have had a chance to vote for the first time. I was recounting to Margaret, I was just recently in Cape Town last week and talking to my friends there. I said, just take me back to the founding elections in South Africa, and like, what was it like to be a black South African, or the category as it was then, a colored South African, and the chance to vote. It's an extraordinary moment, not unlike what I felt in 2000 in Taiwan and what many felt in the 2010s in Myanmar. But what always worried us, and this hopefully will also help answer the situation and the ongoing situation in Thailand, Our worry always was that military regimes, they fear instability more than anything else, and they're the fastest to react to the slightest hint of instability. And what always worried us about, and we see this historically in Thailand, this is the challenge in Thailand, is that anytime there's just the hint of instability, then the military regime is always quick to step back in. And military regimes, they don't want power. They just believe that in their absence, the country will fall apart. And in Myanmar, the worry was always the military, through its party conduit, always maintained 25% of the seats in the parliament. And so the military was always hanging over the shoulder, or hanging over Aung San Suu Kyi. And that made us very nervous. And so at the first hint of instability and a country that then quickly spiraled out of control, it was not at all surprising that the military regime stepped back in, and we see what we see now. And so, had the book actually come out when it was supposed to come out, which was 5 years ago, we would have gotten that all wrong. Or we would have drawn the wrong conclusions. Although what ends up happening actually is consistent with our theory, but we just wouldn't have known it at the time. And so it's really one of the most tragic things that I've seen.
So the lesson is, if you wait long enough, your theory will get proven as the events will unfold. Well, listen, I think we're supposed to give it a wrap up on this, and so I did ask Khalil and Uju, if I could just close by putting Joe on the spot. Those of you who listen to the Ezra Klein podcast, they always end by asking the guest to speak to 3 books that really influenced you and that you would recommend to your audience here.
Okay. As a professor, I have like a reading list that's like 100 pages long.
I know.
So, I won't go with the scholarly books. There are a whole bunch. So 3 books. So one, there's a book by Erik Larson. I don't know if you've read him before. He's a historical nonfiction writer, but writes in a way that's very compelling in narrative form, called In the Garden of Beasts. If you haven't read it yet, it's prophetic, actually, eerily so. It's a description of Berlin in the 1930s, and the American ambassador at the time was William Dodd, I think was his name. He was a professor at the University of Chicago, so no one paid any attention to him. And he was the ambassador there, and he was sending cables back to Washington through the 30s saying, there's something going on here. I think we need to pay attention. And nobody did. And we saw what happened, right? It's a reminder that the Nationalist Socialists, became the Nazis, were in fact elected, that there were all these signs there. And I really worry, and actually on the night that Donald Trump was elected, I tweeted Erik Larson and I said, I hope your book was not prophetic. And he tweeted back and he said, I hope so, I hope not as well, but I fear it might have been. And so that I think is really important, just to remind us that democracies are very fragile. They are killed by 1,000 slices, and we only see the aftermath, and we tend to forget all the things that happen in between. The second one, I guess this is, there's a Canadian scholar named Daniel Bell, who's at Tsinghua University. He's a philosophy professor, and he wrote a book called The China Model, which I can't stand, but I think it's an important read. I wrote a scathing review of it in the American Political Science Review because I just so fundamentally disagreed with it, but it's good scholarship. I just hate the conclusions that he draws. And essentially he argues that the China model is an authoritarian, the China model is a legitimation of authoritarian roadmap for development. And I think in many ways, you have to grapple with it. I think it's completely wrong, and you can read my review of it. But you have to grapple with it because I think he's captured the kind of zeitgeist that is shaping our conversations around how we think about China right now. And I think in the review that I wrote, you know, there's something along the lines of, because he essentially argues that authoritarianism is necessary for economic development or the developmental state in Asia. And from a pure sort of economic point of view or political economy point of view, there's nothing in the developmental experience in East Asia that required authoritarianism, except for maybe early on labor repression in order to encourage more wage compression. But frankly, these days, wage compression is no longer a competitive advantage. So it's just, it just doesn't economically make sense. But so I don't know if your question was a book I like or a book we should read. So it's a book I can't stand, but I think you should need to read it. And then the third thing is, I would say, it's not a book, but it's something I assigned to all my students. It was written in like 2012 or so. It was a New York Times Magazine article on Paul Kagame. It was something like the dictator that the West loves or something like that. You look it up, like New York Times Magazine Kagame. I loved it because it was this journalist who was doing an in-depth story of Kagame, who's the ruler of Rwanda. And he basically, in many ways, Rwanda has modeled itself after Singapore, and except Kagame is much nastier than Lee Kuan Yew ever was. But it's funny because, like, he's the journalist or the author is writing this, and you can clearly see he's totally being seduced by Kagame, right? And in the article or the magazine article, the story ends with him saying, like, you know, I was totally seduced by this guy. He's so charismatic, and yet I'm reminded that he's like pathological, right? And that there is a real kind of evilness to this. And this is, I think it's such an important read because that's what dictators are. They're extremely charismatic. They're extremely seductive, and they're extremely charismatic. And I've interviewed lots of dictators, and I leave all the time thinking, like, geez, I really like this guy. But, and the other thing is that they all truly believe that if they weren't in power, the country will fall apart. And in that regard, they're really patriotic. They truly are patriotic people. They're just pathological. And so I think that article is such a great read because you'll be seduced until the very end, and you actually then start, you know, inventorizing all of the nasty things that have occurred, and you're like, how can I possibly like this guy? And I think we all have to grapple with it. It's like, I think it was like the West's favorite strong man or something like that. Hope that helps. So these aren't my, I don't
Those
really
are all
like
three
reading
great
them, but
ideas.
you should read them. Yeah.
Well, listen, I think, do I turn it over now to you? We're going to turn it over to you. Yeah, thank you very much. Yes.
Thank you very much, Margaret and Joseph, for today's conversation on every front and all fronts in terms of the ideas and topics that we went to. And just quickly to all of our guests who are in the room, and then also to everyone who is joining us online, we'd like for you to take an opportunity to let us know how the event went. So there's a QR code that's coming on the screen and also will be shared in the chat online, and we just love to get your feedback. So we're going to leave this up on the screen as we wrap up, but please, you might also have a card on your seats for those who are in the room as well. It also has the QR code. We just love to get your feedback as we continue to have more events and have more global read sessions, and also just ideate from our audience, things that people are looking forward to, conversations that people are interested in. And definitely we're already building our 2024 calendar of global read sessions as well. So please take out time to share your feedback with us. And just to formally wrap up today's session, let's welcome Khalil back to the stage.
Thanks very much, Uju. Well, look, it remains to me, for me to thank Margaret and Joe for this extraordinary discussion that was wide-ranging. You know, Aga Khan Foundation Canada is a development institution, and development is not only about end states, it's about processes of change over time. And what the book and this conversation has shed light on for us is what are the alternative processes of change that are present in diverse societies around the world? And then what do actors, internal and external, have to do to catalyze the most promising forces of change and hopefully starve the most pernicious forces of change in those environments? And what this book has, I think, helped us do is just shed light on a dark corner of the alternative pathways to these end states which we all aspire to for ourselves and for all of our fellow people in humanity. And so, Joe, you've done us a great service by shedding light on these pathways, and for that we're very much in your debt. I do commend the book to you, From Development to Democracy: The Transformation of the Modern Asia. I think you'll find it, as you can see, illuminating and interesting. Please stay in touch with us. If you're not on our events list, you'll be able to get on it through the information on your screens, so that you can continue being part of these discussions and steer us in ways wise and insightful. So thank you all for joining us. Good night.